give people another minute or two to join, and then we'll get started. Thanks everyone for being here. Great, so I'll go ahead and introduce our speaker for today. So we are fortunate to have our colleague, Michael VanRooyen, who is the director of the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. He's a professor here at the school and at the med school, and the chairman of the emergency medicine department at Brigham. And so he's going to talk with us today about humanitarian futures, what will drive humanitarian assistance, and how we will respond. So I'll leave it to you, Mike, to take it away.
Awesome. Welcome, everybody. Great to see everybody. I'm going to share my screen here. Voila. Good. Thanks for joining, and and hopefully if you have any questions as you go along, you can put them in the chat and Maggie can help us out. So once again, my name is Mike VanRooyen. I have the two jobs. I run the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, which is an interfaculty program across Harvard, focusing on humanitarian studies and humanitarian issues, really in war and disaster. And then I also am the chairman of emergency medicine for Brigham Health. So I oversee all the business, the clinical care, research, and everything for the Brigham, the Faulkner, and the network around us. So it's great to be here with everybody and to chat. Just a little bit more background. I've most of my career has been spent both dueling as an emergency physician and then working back and forth in areas of war and conflict around the world. So for the past 30 years, I've worked in lots of the great, or a lot of the big conflicts around the world, including Iraq, North Korea, Sudan, Somalia, Rwanda, et cetera, et cetera. So it's been a really interesting time as somebody that's been in the field a lot, but now a lot of my time is sort of spent building HHI and then launching my colleagues. So I want to talk a little bit today about, the slide transition is funky, but a little bit about what is a humanitarian emergency. First of all, I kind of put this in front of almost every other talk that I do, because it's important for us to frame what a humanitarian emergency is and what aid is, just so when we're talking about innovations in aid, we understand the context. I want to talk a little bit about drivers of humanitarian emergencies. In other words, what create crises around the world and what influences them. Talk about some trends in the aid environment, and really about how can we improve aid through new innovations and some technologies. So we'll describe that. Hopefully I'll wrap up in about 30 minutes, and then we can have questions and talk about it as well. So unfortunately I can't see you, so I'm just speaking to the screen, but interrupt and you can get questions, and Maggie can flag me. So first of all, what's a humanitarian crisis? I think when you Google humanitarian, it can any manner of things that can come up, and we call lots of things humanitarian, but there's actually a technical term that really describes what a humanitarian crisis is. And it is an event that overwhelms the local capacity of any series of structures such that it requires large scale international assistance. So if I were to look at this slide, for example, some of these would indicate a humanitarian crisis, while others wouldn't. So having a war in Syria, for example, can precipitate a humanitarian crisis because of the effects on the civilian population. In the middle upper, the World Trade Center attacks, however terrible and however big disaster it was, did not precipitate a humanitarian emergency. There wasn't need for large-scale multi-country initiatives to help stabilize the situation. Gender-based violence as a result of conflict in Afghanistan, for example, can result in a humanitarian emergency because it focuses on a particular subset of people that are particularly affected. And then things like disaster, for example, the earthquake in Haiti that requires external assistance does, as well as does displacement. So if we were to measure it like what it is, a humanitarian emergency is basically conditions that lead to 2 or more times the baseline mortality in a certain circumstance. So a disaster, war, or some event that leads to baseline mortality, or conditions that create an acute threat to survival. For example, a mass migration, human rights abuses, ethnic cleansing, genocide, and threats to specific groups. And so without a major external intervention, conditions will prevail that it would threaten or lead to the death or destruction of these groups. So that's kind of how we define a humanitarian crisis and differentiate it from things like development. So if we were to say, like, what is aid and what does it seek to accomplish? Humanitarian aid really focuses on the acute provision of services that help stabilize populations. I'll use my medical example. So as an emergency physician, I have an emergency department, and it's well equipped to take care of whatever happens. So if you, as a you have you need a colonoscopy, or you need your blood pressure checked, or you need something else to be done, you go to either your family physician or some specialty physician, and that's for the maintenance of your health. But if you get hit by a car or shot or fall out of a tree, the emergency department is there all the time. So the emergency department is available for individual rescue in case something happens. Humanitarian aid is kind of like that in the global health world. It's sort of there for population rescue, as opposed to say the longer term developmental concepts. And this can be illustrated by sort of the sectors of aid. So on the left upper is what happens in aid is for emergency water supplies for mobile populations or refugee populations versus digging wells and having water projects for longer term sustainable projects. That's the difference between aid and development. Food distribution and food shipments, for example, that are flown in or trucked in to stabilize a population versus agricultural projects that we see that are for a longer duration. And finally, medical care and makeshift facilities, for example, versus longer term capacity building. Those all represent the emergency responses to population threats that hopefully can stabilize the population, so you can get from the left side of the screen to the right side of the screen ultimately. And we'll talk a little bit more about the nuances of that. But that's a difference between kind of humanitarian and development. Now, obviously, there's a blending of that, and we call it the nexus, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So what humanitarian aid is sort of sector-based responses to acute population needs to stabilize the population. What are those sectors? The sectors can be, as I've just mentioned, food, water, sanitation, housing, but these are all the major sectors in the humanitarian aid world as represented by the cluster system. So if you look at it, you can see things like education or telecom or food security. These are all areas that we would see as sectors of activity that would work together, but they're also kind of distinct areas that provide emergency aid to stabilize populations. So that's kind of the sector-based approach to humanitarian aid. All right, so now let's talk about the drivers of humanitarian crisis. So as we know that if you think about the things that lead to and develop population vulnerability in acute situation, these are kind of the drivers of humanitarian crisis. Again, let's use our medical example for a second. So we might say, for example, that air pollution creates a risk of cancer, or smoking creates a risk of cancer, and that is a bigger sort of longer term health issue. But say a crash on the highway will lead to injuries. That's much more of an issue that drives an emergency. Similar things can drive humanitarian crises and increase the impact of those crises. The big one is war and conflict. So out of the number of crises around the world, including those in conflict areas around the world, like Yemen, Nigeria, Somalia, etc., war is the great destabilizer and the great de-developer. It creates direct threats to the population through killing people, but more devastating are the indirect threats or the deprivation threats. In other words, out of every person, there's a graphic that I didn't include, but I could have. For every one person in the Congo that is directly killed by the conflict in Eastern DRC, there's 75 or 80 people that die as a result of deprivation, lack of public health, lack of healthcare, lack of access, logistics, etc. So the victims of war are not really combatants nearly as much as they are civilians. And so humanitarian aid is really required to stabilize civilian populations in conflict. So conflict is a major driver. Another one is disaster, of course. So each year there's a large number of people that are displaced by natural hazards and natural disasters. Particularly flooding is really very difficult, cyclonic storms and flooding. But other impressive events can drive populations to migrate and therefore become vulnerable. most of that vulnerability is really focused on lower lower income areas where people have less resilience. Certainly, the population concentration of poverty is a big issue. So while much of the world has been lifted out of poverty over the last 30 years, particularly in Asia, poverty concentration in certain areas, particularly those in conflicted areas and in politically unstable areas, is really a dominant issue. And because poverty also decreases resilience to major threats, either natural or man-made threats like war. Another big issue is just the de-development that occurs through war and conflict and sequential disaster. So it's really hard for a country to pull itself or help pull itself out of, this is I think in the DRC, out of conflict when, or out of poverty when they have constant conflict, disaster, or destabilizing events. Another one is climate change, of course. We talk about climate change a lot, but climate change has the direct effect of, affecting populations by, sort of heat or water emergencies in certain areas. But also probably the more dominant effects are precipitating population movement. Certainly the desertification of the Sahara is a huge deal, as well as many coastal flooding areas that really move populations, destabilize populations, cause tremendous loss in economic opportunity, and really decimate populations. Water insecurity is a big one. So having the lack or the challenges with water insecurity is a major factor, and the desertification of the Sahara is one. But we see several climate-related emergencies. Certainly, Madagascar is a big one. Darfur was a big one, and others. This will be an increasingly important feature of both disaster, humanitarian aid, and conflict in the future. Certainly, okay, this is an obvious one, right? But even before the Ebola epidemic, the existence of existing and new pandemics, such as not only COVID, but HIV, SARS, prior SARS, regular influenza, as it were, as well as Ebola, Zika, and others, really create increased morbidity, mortality, and again, focused on areas in the world that have less resilience, less resources, and less ability to manage these. And we'll talk a little more about that in a second. Another one is chronic emergency. So not only is it an acute emergency, like say a war that precipitates movement of people, or a disaster, but also chronic emergencies of chronic displacement. So refugee camps that have on the Thai-Burma border that have been there for decades and decades, or the wars in Darfur that now are entering into its second decade. The idea, actually, yeah, it's beyond second decade. And so the idea that, refugees, we think of a refugee as an acute movement, but the average time that a refugee spends in displacement or out of their country or before they're repatriated or settled is 17 years. It's not a matter of days or weeks or months. And then finally, state fragility. All of these things add up to state fragility. Bad governance, conflict, terrorism, climate change, poverty, they all compound in a threat that creates the sense of state fragility. And I'm going to go through a few maps very quickly just to show you how that lines up, because it gives you kind of a graphical representation of this notion of compounding threats. So if we look at, say, things like population growth as a measure of total fertility rates, just if you don't even have to look specifically, but you can look in the central Middle East and North African region is where there are highest areas of fertility, meaning that there's more rapid population growth. Okay, so we see that that's probably the case. There's some areas of negative population growth or nearly so, but we see that rapid population growth here. If we were going to say global poverty concentration, it's in similar areas in the central Central African region and some in the MENA region. So we have global poverty concentration as well. It's superimposed over areas with greater population growth. Then if we look at water stress areas, typically these are in the MENA region, so that we have several areas that are water stressed. Certainly, even in the United States, particularly in the western part of the United States, there's tremendous water stress, but there is more resilience to manage it. Then if you look at climate-related stress, not just water, but heat, and the combination of water scarcity, crop insecurity is also, you can see this, particularly this MENA and the Middle East, North African region. and food insecurity similarly as well, Central Africa. So if you take all of these things and you superimpose these maps on each other, you can tell the areas that are going to have significant compounding vulnerabilities in areas that we're going to be working in many years. Now, the additional threat to this is state fragility. And state fragility comes from these threats, but also in governance issues. In other words, the threats to good governance or stable governance. So the compounding vulnerability of conflict, war, climate stressors, population growth and fertility rates, et cetera, create an environment where we have significant challenges in state fragility. And that's how we think about sort of forecasting where humanitarian aid needs to go and how we need to develop mechanisms for better aid delivery. So those are sort of the macro level drivers of like how aid gets, or how humanitarian crises happen and get worse. But there's some other policy drivers as well, things that happen that we control from a geopolitical perspective that help tell us that, you know, what makes things worse. So this is a ridiculous picture, but it is, it's true that we've had increasing nationalistic tendencies for a long time. So the investments by Russia, the US, and certainly a big player, this is obviously North Korea, but a big player is China. So the investments have been really focusing on national interests, and in some degrees, the reduction of the sort of role and policy role of the UN. So the role of the UN is incredibly important, but in many ways, the UN is used as a diplomatic tool for many other developmental agendas of the US, certainly, but also of China and other countries that wish to have a bigger developmental footprint. So the combination of growing our own national policy interests at the expense of other countries and shrinking role of the UN to sort of counter some of these leads to some lopsided ways that we can see development happening. Certainly our nationalism really affects our role of migration and the way we see migration and accept migration. If you ever look at a map of migration, population migration, we tend to think that it's globalized, and it is indeed become much more globalized over the last 10, 15, 20 years. But still the dominant motion of people that are fleeing war, conflict, disaster, or even things like economic displacement are really displaced from one setting to a nearby setting. So this is a flow of refugees by origin on the left and countries of asylum to the right. And we think that like all of these people are coming to the United States or Europe, but actually the dominant flow of refugees and displacement from Syria, for example, you can see is neighboring countries, Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, et cetera. Afghanistan similarly, Somalia similarly. So the strain that refugee movements place on Western or sort of northern countries is far, far less than the strain it places on neighboring countries that already have challenges. So the idea that, you know, the economies and the ability for countries like Lebanon to manage a major flow of migrants is a really tricky and dangerous issue. Climate change, of course, we talked about it a little bit, but climate change, it just needs to be really mentioned because the idea that climate and climate crises can precipitate both acute issues, intrastate problems, in other words, or interstate problems, in other words, conflict between states, including water rights and water privileges and dam building, and then conflict within a country in terms of migration, migratory populations, and populations that are on top of each other. So water is increasingly an issue that is going to drive crisis in the future. It'll drive migration in the future, and it'll create further conflict so that things like the Ataturk Dam project in Turkey, for example, can lead to, and was a major precipitant of the Syrian war. And we see this in many circumstances. Water wars will be, we just, because of climate change and because of climate pressures and because of the desertification of the Sahara, et cetera, it's predicted that water wars will be contributing more frequently to conflicts going forward. This is an interesting example, actually. I just brought this up. It's funny because you wouldn't have thought this. This is 1783. So if lest you think that this is a new phenomenon, climate And climate changes can really precipitate conflict in many ways that you can't necessarily predict. So in 1783 and 84, there was a volcanic fissure, Laki, interrupted in Iceland and drove a huge plume through the air, which actually froze parts of the Mississippi. It froze parts, or it caused this haze over Europe, and it caused this devastating effects of crops all throughout Europe. Ultimately, that caused famine in Iceland, caused a lot of climate change all the way to the United States, and caused famines in France, Norway, Netherlands, Italy, Spain, and Egypt, and was one of the, along with bad politics, was a major precipitant of the revolution in France, so the French Revolution. So the economic hardship and the indifference of the French monarchy led to the sort of French Revolution. So there's a significant contribution, and this is played over in many common and current situations. So how do we think of challenges facing the aid community? So we talked about some of the needs and the drivers of humanitarian need, and the way that aid needs to be delivered in migratory populations or in conflicted populations or those facing humanitarian emergencies. But some of the challenges facing those populations are the difficulties in getting aid to places, right? The scale is a big problem, like the scale of emergencies. If you imagine, if you told, say, a company like, I don't know, Johnson & Johnson, that they had to triple the size of their organization within 3 weeks to scale up for something massive, even with the COVID epidemic, companies have tremendous difficulty being able to do that. And yet we ask the aid world, aid communities in the UN and others, and particularly NGOs like Save the Children, CARE, Oxfam, Doctors Without Borders, et cetera, to literally double their budgets in certain areas overnight to be able to manage a humanitarian emergency. It's really difficult. So the scale of emergencies is a major challenge. Funding stability is another one. A lot of funding is not targeted towards preparedness for emergencies or resilience issues. They're funded after the fact. It's like giving you funding to buy a fire truck while the fire is burning. So there's a lot of funding challenges in the aid world around providing stable upfront funding for humanitarian aid. Access is a big one. So gaining political access and gaining humanitarian access. So not many of the places that require humanitarian aid suffer from difficulties in gaining access, difficult political actors, et cetera. Political complexity is not just in the aid community and in the areas that we're working, but also in the policies that are in place for us to work. So the aid community is working in a policy environment that is very problematic. In other words, the reason that the humanitarian emergency in Yemen or in Syria occurs is a policy failure. It's a political failure. It's not an aid failure. So the challenges are really in many of the policy failures that we see. Aid neutrality is an issue. This is a growing threat to aid workers and anybody that undertakes the humanitarian aid work, that no longer is it seen as neutral. So in my tenure in the aid world, after 30 years, there's a major difference and major shift with the perception of aid as being earmarked for certain populations or supporting certain subgroups, and therefore aid workers are under threat. And finally, just organizational barriers, the ability for aid organizations to work together, and the funding lines and capacity building they have, as well as some kind of important things about incentives for things I'm going to mention in a minute, like localization, decolonization, or things like that. So lots of challenges facing the aid world. So given the fact that aid occurs in war and conflict, it affects large groups of civilian populations, it requires rapid deployment of services in multiple sectors of activity, it works in very difficult to work in conditions, and it's impacted by a lot of the geopolitical trends in our world. How can it get better? How are we making it better, or can it get better? And there's a number of things that I wanted to talk about today that can help us think about the aid world and innovations in the aid space so that we can actually do this better. And some of these come along the lines of more flexible funding, approaches to funding, localization, decolonization efforts, et cetera. So let's talk about these in 3 buckets: policy, operational issues, and technical solutions. So if we think about humanitarian strategies and policy, some of these things were driven by kind of a big meeting that happened about 5 years ago in the World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul. This really got aid actors together. Many of us went and talked about like what were the major features of aid in the future and where is it going to go and what needs to change. And it really came away with this, what they said is the agenda for humanity and this thing called the Grand Bargain. I'm going to skip this slide and go to the Grand Bargain. The Grand Bargain is this big agreement for major non-government organizations and major funding organizations and entities that really aim to push funding directly to recipients and to local and national responders. This was by 2020, and they're still working on this. The goal of the Grand Bargain is to leverage the funding that we have and the funding that is coming in, increase it and move more of it to the hands of the people who need it. This has been partially successful in some areas. The major commitments are distilled into sort of 9 thematic streams that are still in play. And we don't have to read these, but they're better transparency, better funding for local responders, cash-based programming, which is incredibly important and has been very successful, I think, as well as kind of all the ways that we can localize care or localize relief. And we'll talk about that a little bit more now. There's this thing called the Humanitarian Development Peace Nexus. That the HDP Nexus is really around, if you imagine here, I'll just click it, the Venn diagrams of humanitarian activity that we see in acute stabilization of populations, how it translates to longer term development, and how it may or may not contribute to longer term peace and security. And that Humanitarian Development Peace Nexus, called the Triple Nexus, is an approach that organizations are trying to take to leverage the bigger money that may be available for humanitarian relief, transition it to longer term development, but to do so in a way that supports peace, prosperity, and the ability of people to have self-directed work. So this notion is a kind of a reframing of the way that we think about funding humanitarian programming that leads to longer term development and peace type functions. Another concept is actually advancing strategies for preparedness. Now it shouldn't be a shock that we have areas in the world that are particularly natural disaster prone, and that it's far more beneficial and far more cost effective to invest in building codes in Haiti or resilient water systems in the Philippines in order to reduce the impact of natural disasters. That's pretty easy. What's a little bit harder is to actually invest in resilient strategies in conflict affected areas or areas that are potentially conflict affected. Now, those are things like, how do you invest in good governance? How do you invest in helping development solutions withstand a change in governments, for example? So there's some challenges in this one. This forecast-based financing or anticipatory action is really trying to understand the drivers of a crisis, how to mitigate those, forecast them, and act before they happen so you can mitigate the need for disasters as well. This doesn't seem actually particularly innovative, but in the aid world, that has really been driven by just-in-time funding for humanitarian action. It's pretty important to actually reframe the way that we do this. So this is a big policy push that needs to be taken up by the donor population as well. Let's move to a few operational issues. There's a few operational issues that can also drive and improve and change the aid world as well. One of them is the issue of localization. In other words, this is basically building local capacity in all of the areas we work. Strangely, COVID has actually assisted with this localization agenda because it's obstructed the travel of the kind of the aid organizations that are working in places. So I was just on the Kenya-Somalia border, for example, and there's not a way to get there. It was very difficult to get there for security reasons, and also it's difficult to get there because of COVID. So what that did is necessitate the aid world actually had to use and work with local providers in order to build their capacity to do relief, which again, kind of makes a lot of sense, right? We should be doing that stuff, and we have been doing it all along, but we haven't been doing enough of it and not as much of a sort of a concerted effort. Now, a sort of bigger issue around this issue is decolonizing aid. And that is actually really building the capacity of organizations, not just to do the work, but actually be self-directed. So instead of saying, on one end of the spectrum before localization is that, hey, we're a Western aid organizations, we're going to fund each other to go in and make changes. But now as we look at localization, we're going to fund local organizations to make those changes. Decolonization really flips it around and says that the funding may have to come initially from organizations and countries in the global north, but actually needs to be determined, the spending needs to be determined and monitored and managed by the global south and leverage additional funding from the global south. So decolonizing aid is really to try to change the way that aid is represented, the recipients are represented, even the word recipient changes. So the notion and the movement for decolonizing aid is far bigger than just, say, building localization. And it has to do with the rubric we use and the way that we generate funding, the way there's oversight of funding, the way that we're providing organizational support, and really making sure that countries and regions have the total autonomy to do with aid dollars what they believe is right. So there's a lot of work in decolonizing aid, and it is a sticky, challenging issue. Certainly, negotiated access and protection remains a big thing that we're working on a lot, and that is how do we get to places we need to go? It is, there are many, I just had a presentation from our team on Central African Republic, and it is extremely difficult to move around because COVID is an issue, but the big issue is just a conflicted area that there's no access and no way to get access. So the ability to train organizations and work with organizations and diplomatic fronts, both from the high policy side all the way down to the field, to obtain and secure access and protection of recipients and populations. Then finally, I'll talk about some technical solutions, and I'll open up for some questions so we can let you to ask a few questions. Technical solutions are really technology and technical solutions that have really assisted us in many ways of providing better aid, faster aid, and push this issue of localization and decolonization further into the field. One big need, we're getting there, but we're not still there because it hasn't been funded properly for a long time, is global epidemic surveillance. The idea that we have a globalized community of epidemic surveillance that really works is actually pretty brand new. COVID can help us with this, but back in the days of even recently, the first real big, not the first, but the big Ebola epidemic in Sierra Leone and Guinea and Liberia created a big challenge because there was inadequate epidemic surveillance. So we are a global economy, we are a global community, and we have to have global epidemic surveillance. Cash and cash-based programming. This is a big and important revolution. And actually it's happened because we have geo-connectivity, and we'll talk about that one in a second. But cash-based programming has been a dominant form, or has become a dominant form of a lot of the aid that the major organizations like World Food Program, FAO, and others do. And that is the distribution of cash directly to recipients. There's a process by which they engage their local counterparts, local organizations, to determine need and to create sort of the model for distribution, which is not insubstantial, but then the direct distribution of cash to recipients. Now, it's really important in terms of timing. So for example, one of the best ways that cash is used is to stabilize populations so they don't have to migrate, for example, in a drought or a famine. But there are many ways to deploy cash, or what we call cash plus, which is things like cash plus food stores, or cash plus agricultural projects, or cash plus investment into healthcare manpower, or things like that. So cash-based programming is extremely important and has been very successful. And again, COVID has sort of pushed this along even further because, because of access issues, cash-based programming became really important. Crypto, you might say that, that's crazy to think about, but Bitcoin and the World Bank understanding the power of cryptocurrency is going to be really important as well. Cryptocurrency has, obviously many of us worry about cryptocurrency because of its fluctuations and instability. But in areas that crypto is can be matched to, say, the dollar or the pound or the euro, but still crypto carries value. It's much more stable in many cases than local currency. So if you were in Mozambique and inflation was running at 1,000% a week, you'd want to invest in crypto if you could, as opposed to local currency. So the idea that cryptocurrency can play a significant role in mainstream activities of large organizations like the bank or World Food Program is a really compelling thought. Certainly technology applications and in many cases have led the way, and we've had many amazing innovations that have happened very quickly. It seems sort of second nature to everybody that everybody's going to have a cell phone. Well, global connectivity is kind of amazing, actually, but there are some gaps around the world that need to be addressed. But still, this map is rapidly becoming red, and red being high rates of global broadband connectivity through a lot of major innovations. Unfortunately, for better or for worse, there's many places around the world that you can get, excellent cellular or digital data coverage, but there's not a clinic or a bathroom anywhere nearby. But that's a different developmental issue. But what that does is allow people to have control of their own information and their own finance and their own networks, which is actually pretty amazing. So the idea that we can use this level of connectivity not only to distribute cash and distribute resources to people so we can get direct to aid recipients is really powerful. But it also allows us to look at other ways that we can actually share data in the field that we collect, such as assessment data. I'm going to brag about one of our projects at HHI, programs at HHI, called the Kobo Toolbox. If you don't know this, you should look it up. It's really a remarkable data collection sort of platform that is used by almost all of the major, actually all of the major NGOs, almost all of the major United Nations organizations that work in relief development, including UNHCR, OCHA, World Bank, World Food Program, et cetera, to gather field data, to map it, and to share it. So the Kobo platform is basically just you open your laptop up, you design a survey, you send it out to 100 Android phones, you collect the survey, and it uploads the data automatically and maps it. This allows it so you don't need an epidemiologist every time you want to do a study. This system has been so widely adopted in the UN that over 300 million surveys over the last years have been done on the Kobo platform. It is the single biggest data collection, management, and aggregation platform in the world, which is actually fantastic. And it's free, by the way. So another one is the way that we map and geospatial mapping and ways that we can map. This is just a screenshot of an FAO. FAO is a really amazing amount of sort of mapping technologies to look at food security, water insecurity, et cetera. So mapping functions have just got so much more nuanced and so much more granular. As an aid organization or a policy organization, you can know a lot more about what's going on and do a lot more in the way of predictive analytics. Other techie stuff that are, maybe useful, but in my opinion, smaller, things like drones, remote sensing, crowdsourced data. Those are all tools that we can use. Certainly they can be helpful in the short run to help drive relief efforts as well. So geospatial mapping is really important, and HHI has done a lot of work in that area, as well as drones and drone imagery. Drones are not without consequence too, because they're so widespread and available now, but there's major issues with like data protection, privacy, et cetera. Satellite imagery is a big one. The availability of commercial satellite imagery allows us to see images and imagery in areas, particularly conflicted areas as well. This used to be only the military, and now there are many organizations and companies that have much more affordable geospatial analysis that we can use to look at access, population migration, distribution of resources, et cetera. And then knitting it all together is complicated, whether you use GIS, ground source data, crowdsource work, or things like geospatial mapping and drone and satellite imagery. Knitting it all together is kind of the big trick that remains elusive, actually. And I'm getting there. I'll get done with this in a second. Certainly in humanitarian action, the use of big data and predictive analytics and AI is also a big thing. So getting a large data sets like phone usage, for example, to predict population migration and population movement is really useful for advanced planning. We have a partnership with MIT and several others to look at uses of big data analytics and AI in humanitarian action. Then finally, beyond the mobile phone, I mean, we're using and there's deployable, usable technologies that people use all the time to be able to map, coordinate, communicate, identify, and help drive aid and aid specificity around the world, including things like biometric measurement as well. And finally, this brings up the clear issue of data protection, data management, and data security. And so increasingly there's stealing a page from crypto, the applications of blockchain as a security or a data security measure is going to be really important to actually manage and secure the use of and the deployment of data around the world. I think there's a lot of legal and technical standards. I listed some of them here, but I think there's a lot we don't know about the sort of data that's out there and the way data is used. How does international humanitarian law and international human rights law apply? Do we really have well-known ethical standards for the use of digital data in vulnerable populations? Are there minimum technical standards for protection, for example? And then things like, do we quantify harms, understand fragmentation so that there are cyber threats, and then really know how populations use this? And can it be either contribute or obstruct efforts to localize and decolonize? Lots of questions about the use of digital data and the management of sort of innovations in communication technologies. And then finally, future. Like, we're always looking to find out what the big future is. I think one of the major future things is this issue of knitting data together in a way that we don't even see in US healthcare right now. That is to have like real-time decision support to knit data together in order to see what's happening with populations and do predictive analytics. We've got a lot of various technologies, but we're not there in terms of having ways that we can better predict the needs of our populations. So finally, what's next in the way of sort of humanitarian emergencies and humanitarian issues around the world? A lot of the work that HHI is doing is trying to see what's the next crisis or what are the next drivers of humanitarian assistance. And I think about this stuff kind of all the time. I mean, one of the relevant scenarios for HHI, one of the things that we are as an academic institution that works with NGOs and UN agencies and governments and other universities, is to predict what's next in the humanitarian sphere. And I think some of the major areas that I'm thinking of these days are going to be how can we keep the narrative of decolonization and localization moving forward in meaningful ways? How can we really look at diversity in the aid sector in a critical way that needs to be addressed? How do we look at data security and the protection of data in vulnerable populations so that it's not exploited by either commerce, industry, or bad actors? Another one is misinformation. I mean, we see this. It's been just an amazing feature of this COVID epidemic, amazing as in terrible. And the issue of disinformation is a massive one, and the use of disinformation and cyber terrorism is a major feature as well. So we are looking at work in kind of all of those areas, as well as building our capacity to engage with the academic needs of NGOs and UN agencies. So that is it. I have some other slides I was going to talk about HHI for a little bit, but I think I want to just get some questions from you if you do. And then if there's further questions about HHI's programs or how we work, I'd be delighted to talk about it. I'm going to stop sharing should I stop sharing my screen, Maggie, or does it matter?
I think you could leave it just in case, you
Right,
want to highlight
I'll leave it for branding.
Fun.
So yeah, love to get any questions or thoughts that anybody has about kind of this area, or if I'm sure I went pretty fast over some big topics. So fire away.
So we did have, yeah, great. We did have people put your questions in the chat or Q&A. We would love to hear them. There was a question from the tool who asked about this comment you made that for every person killed in Congo due to conflict, there are 70 more that die from deprivation. And she was commenting that that's quite a powerful statement, that maybe we focus on the numbers killed in conflict more, and was asking, how do you build systems that take care of those deprived during conflict or strengthen existing ones?
Yeah, and thank you. It's I wish I would have put the graphic. It's a great graphic. If you ever think that a busy emergency department on a Saturday night in the ER in the United States is intimidating, just go to the editorial desk at the New York Times someday, because that is like chaos in there. And I sat one time with a New York Times reporter and talked about like this issue and measuring it and representing it, because it's a really important concept that people don't really understand so readily. And that is, when you think of war and conflict, let's take any of them. I mean, let's take Yemen right now, or even in areas of Somalia. The direct combatants that are killed by landmines or direct gunshots or bombing of direct combatants is actually limited. It's tragic, but it's limited. But the real deprivation happens because you can't get access to healthcare, and women can't have safe deliveries. There's no surgical services because of the war. There's no vaccinations because of the war. So kids are dying of neonatal tetanus and malaria. There's no ability to get food to populations. And so there's obstructed access to food. And so malnutrition is a greater contributor. So all of those effects of the deprivation of access are actually the major effects of war around the world. And that's why civilian mortality is the major feature of any modern conflict.
Yeah, and I think her question was sort of what kinds of humanitarian initiatives are really effective in sort of building or strengthening systems, that can sort of be focused on some of that deprivation or resilient to, yeah.
Right. Yeah. So the follow-on question, you're exactly right, is what are we doing about it, right? And so there's the diplomatic efforts to try to get combating parties to sort of not target civilian populations, which we've been wholly unsuccessful in doing, because civilians are used as targets. And what that does to the aid community is the bad parts of that is that they're difficult to access those populations, and there are challenges to gain access. So one of the things we need to do as an aid world is measure those populations, understand the impact of on civilian populations, and find solutions to be able to get aid to people at the right time. And a lot of those solutions are local, actually working with local aid providers who are living in Syria or around Syria to get access. So a large majority of the aid that is provided to civilians in Syria, for example, or in and around that area, are performed by organizations and people who are from the area and who have access, local organizations. So one of the things we need to do is have methods to gain diplomatic and on-the-ground access, measurement of population needs, rapid scale-up of population provision of services, working with local organizations to make them better and more able to deliver aid in a timely fashion, and then ultimately kind of this triple nexus stuff, doing longer term or transitioning to longer term sustainable solutions like cash-based programming that help people recover.
Great. So the next question is from Tiffany, who asks about the sort of issues you brought up around scalability of programs during emergencies. And so she asks about your thoughts on potential collaboration between private parties and the aid sector to address this issue of scalability, and in general, what do you see as the role for a private sector in scaling up and making resilient, responsive aid programs?
Yeah, it's a great question and a complicated one. So scaling up aid programs in conflicted areas, there's not as much of a role of industry as in, say, longer term developmental activities, for example. So if you're scaling up, there's a large scale migration in Yemen, for example, or in CAR, the private public partnerships are less of an issue, and more of an issue is actually mobilizing advanced funding from UN pooled sources. So like the pooled funding in UN OCHA, for example, can allow rapid access to ready cash to handle those migratory populations early. The role of industry and private-public partnerships, et cetera, are really important for longer-term humanitarian issues and transitions into longer-term developmental strategies. So say, for example, partnering with a large telecom company can be really helpful in an acute emergency because you can establish broadband coverage very quickly or telecom coverage quickly to help you do relief efforts. But the bigger meaningful contribution is going to be establishing broadband coverage and digital data coverage in the long term to help people get access. So those kind of public-private partnerships actually are working. There's a lot of them underway. Like many organizations are working at big data management companies, for example, to try to manage their data. Some of them are telecoms. Some of them are industrial partnerships or things like agricultural partnerships. But those are really move over to the longer-term development solutions.
So I don't see another question for the moment. I'll let people continue to think of their questions. But I was, since I'll take the moderator's privilege of asking my own question, which is, you mentioned the sort of increasing use of cash transfers and the pandemic, sort of driving those forward. I wonder if you can sort of reflect on how you think those are received by different sort of sectors of the sort of aid community, and any, what are the sort of concerns about potential unintended consequences of sort of moving towards a more, cash-based approach where more sort of the total share of dollars that goes into humanitarian aid goes directly to participants versus other types of programs.
Yeah. So I think it's the ability, if you think about sort of what happens in cash transfers, well, first of all, like back to COVID actually, was really obviously a spectacular disruption to so many things and really upended so many ways that we work, that we think, the way we socialize, the way we do everything. And there's some pros and cons, right? And we all know that there's some really wonderful realizations that we have, like, we can actually really work from home and we can actually Zoom a lot of stuff, and you don't have to actually fly to Geneva for every meeting or New York for every meeting, right? But at the same time, it's been very challenging. I think some of those challenges have been very real in terms of humanitarian access, but they've forced the aid world to actually then scale up pretty quickly their funding of local organizations and cash transfer work. Cash transfer, or cash plus, which is cash plus other stuff, allows the sort of careful identification of recipients, which is not always easy, to distribute cash to. I think the naysayers of cash would be pretty quick to say that it's rife with, could be subject to corruption, right? In other words, there's lots of skimming from the top. Believe me, the aid world there's so much corruption that can happen in the direct distribution of resources anyway, or in the layering of getting aid programming to organizations. So if you think, gosh, you've got a big funder like USAID that funds a big organization like CARE, which is a great organization, that funds their all local office of CARE, that funds a local group that's going to be doing work that gets programming to the ground, right? By the end of that, you're supporting a pretty huge infrastructure. Whereas if you can have, organizations like USAID fund a big organization that actually can distribute cash, or fund directly small organizations that can distribute cash more effectively and more without the middleman, essentially, is much more efficient from a kind of monetary perspective. It also, frankly, people know what they want and know what they need. And so in the middle of a war or a major disaster, in the middle of it, cash is probably not as effective as material support. There's no food, so you can't buy food. There's no water, so you can't buy water. There's no shelter, so you can't buy it. So there's still going to be a place for emergent delivery of aid supplies, but pretty quickly people know what they want. And as long as the market doesn't get upended because of inflation or whatever, cash is really important and really good. And it does the wonderful thing of putting money directly in the hands of, say, the woman head of household, for example, so that it gets taken care of. So it gets much more directly to the people who need it, and it gets spent locally, and it supports local markets, and it supports local recovery pretty quickly. So cash is actually an amazingly powerful tool, and we will see that it'll continue to grow in its dominance of aid distribution.
Really interesting. Any last comments from the audience? I think this was a terrific presentation, sort of retrospective and prospective, and thank you for sharing all the work that you've been doing.
Well, my pleasure. So I think, we're really lucky. HHI is kind of a weird beast, actually, in the university. I'll just end my couple minutes by saying that it's been, for the last 15 years to build a humanitarian organization in a university that's actually responsive to needs of NGOs and UN, and goes out in the field and does data collection and sends people abroad, is actually quite unusual for Harvard. And it's sometimes challenging because Harvard's not particularly fast in sort of processing money, for example. We have lots of stories around that. But I think the idea is, by leveraging, you as students and faculty, your talents, and the intellectual talents of the Kennedy School, and the business school, and the law school, and the School of Public Health and Medicine, those faculty sort of areas of expertise as leverage to really do research and education in the humanitarian aid industry is an amazing resource. So, HHI is doing some of it, but we could do a lot more of it. And I think it's a really interesting concept to have an academic entity that's trying to empower and improve aid around the world. So it's been fun, and appreciate your interest.
Thanks so much. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thanks everyone. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.